December 7, 1944. The frost-covered forests near the Belgian town of Bastogne stretched endlessly before the soldiers of the 333rd Infantry Regiment, part of the American forces holding the line during one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. In those frozen trenches, where breath turned to ice crystals, before it left your lips and fingers went numb inside supposedly insulated gloves within minutes of exposure. Private First Class Eugene Walker cleaned his Springfield rifle for the third time that morning, using a piece of cloth that had long since lost its ability to absorb moisture, and now simply redistributed the condensation that formed on every metal surface. The German forces positioned across the valley, perhaps 800 yards distant through bare trees that provided minimal concealment, had established sniper positions that made every movement above the trench line a calculated risk with death, turning routine activities like retrieving rations or repositioning equipment into exercises in tactical movement that would have seemed absurd just months earlier. Most American soldiers believed that superior firepower alone would win this war, that the industrial might pouring from Detroit and Pittsburgh, from the assembly lines that produced tanks faster than Germany, could destroy them, and ammunition by the trainload would overwhelm any individual skill the enemy possessed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood yet, least of all the German marksmen who watched the American lines through precision-crafted optics manufactured in the finest workshops of Europe, instruments that cost more than most soldiers earned in a year and represented centuries of optical engineering refinement, was that ingenuity born from necessity and discrimination, from a lifetime of making do with less and succeeding anyway, would soon turn their calculated superiority into a nightmare they could neither predict nor escape, challenging every assumption they held about American capabilities and forcing them to reconsider fundamental beliefs about how this war would be fought. Eugene Walker had grown up in rural Georgia during the Depression, the youngest son of a sharecropper who worked land his family would never own, no matter how many years they spent breaking their backs in fields that belonged to white landowners who paid just enough to keep them coming back each season. His father, Samuel Walker, had taught him to hunt in woods, where missing your shot meant your family went hungry that week, where ammunition was expensive enough that every round had to count, where you learned to make impossible shots because second chances were a luxury reserved for people with money to waste. By the time Eugene was 12 years old, barely tall enough to hold his father's old rifle steady without using a tree for support, he could drop a running rabbit at 80 yards with iron sights, reading wind by watching how grass bent and calculating drop, with an intuition that came from thousands of rounds fired with ammunition his family could barely afford. Shells they bought one box at a time when they had spare money, which was not often. When the war came and he enlisted, walking into the recruitment office in Atlanta on a cold January morning in 1943, joining one of the segregated units that the military relegated to support roles and labor battalions, because white officers convinced themselves that black men lacked the intelligence and courage for combat, Eugene discovered that his marksmanship meant nothing to an army that saw his skin color before his skill. The qualification course he shot set records for his training company, placing every round in the center mass at ranges that challenged even the instructors. But the sergeant who recorded his scores, a career soldier from Alabama who made no secret of his views on integration, simply shook his head and muttered something about luck before moving to the next recruit. The 333rd had been assigned to hold a section of the line that command considered low priority, a quiet sector where, theoretically, not much happened because the terrain offered no strategic value and both sides had bigger concerns elsewhere. The reality was different, as reality often is when plans made by officers studying maps in heated headquarters encountered the actual situation on the ground. German snipers had turned the area into a hunting ground, picking off American soldiers with methodical precision that spoke of professional training and excellent equipment. Men who had been doing this since the invasion of Poland and had survived through skill that went far beyond what training manuals could teach. Every morning brought new casualties, Men who made the mistake of standing too long in one spot, or silhouetting themselves against the sky, or simply being in the wrong place when a German marksman decided to take a shot. Bodies that had to be recovered after dark, because attempting it during daylight meant adding more casualties to the count. Sergeant William Morrison, a career soldier from Pennsylvania who had joined the Army during the Depression because it offered steady employment when factory jobs disappeared, who had fought in North Africa before being transferred to the European theatre and seen enough combat to understand that courage came in all colors while cowardice was equally distributed, gathered his squad in the relative safety of a reinforced dugout on the morning of December 8th. The dugout smelled of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and the particular odor of fear that permeated any position that had seen recent casualties, a smell Morrison had learned to recognize during his years of service. Morrison was one of the few white officers who treated his black soldiers as equals, having learned in the deserts of Tunisia that courage and competence had nothing to do with complexion, that the men who held positions when everyone else ran or who walked into fire to retrieve wounded comrades came from every background, and that survival often depended on recognizing ability wherever it appeared. Morrison said, his breath visible in the freezing air that turned the dugout into a barely warmer version of the frozen landscape outside, "We have lost 6 men in the past 4 days to enemy marksmen." Intelligence reports, such as they are from a command structure that barely acknowledges we exist, indicate at least 3, possibly 4, highly trained individuals operating from positions in the tree line approximately 600 to 800 yards from our forward positions. They have optical sights, probably Zeiss or similar quality, manufactured in facilities that specialize in precision optics, giving them a significant advantage in identification and accuracy that our standard-issue iron sights cannot match. Eugene listened carefully, studying the rough map Morrison had sketched on a piece of cardboard salvaged from ration boxes, the kind of improvised intelligence product that characterized units operating on the margins of command attention. The German positions were well chosen, offering overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback routes through the forest, selected by men who understood their craft and had time to prepare. Standard American rifles, even in skilled hands operating under perfect conditions, struggled to match the effective range and precision of the enemy weapons, and perfect conditions were something no one had experienced in weeks of cold, wet misery. "Private Walker," Morrison said, turning to Eugene with an expression that mixed hope and desperation, the look of a man who understood he was asking for something borderline impossible but had no other options. "I have seen your qualification scores. I talked to the sergeant who supervised your training, and when I pushed past his other commentary, which I will not repeat, he admitted you could shoot better than anyone he had ever tested. But we need more than good shooting right now. We need someone who can reach out to those distances and do it without the equipment those German boys are using, someone who can level a playing field that is currently tilted entirely in their favor." Eugene nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Morrison was asking and the implications that went far beyond this specific tactical problem. The Springfield rifle he carried was accurate, certainly capable of the ranges they were discussing if the shooter knew what they were doing, but without optical magnification, making precise shots at 600 yards or more required exceptional skill, perfect conditions, and a good measure of luck. The German snipers had all 3, plus the psychological advantage of knowing they owned the battlefield, that they could shoot with impunity, while American soldiers crouched in trenches and waited for the next casualty. That night, Eugene lay in his dugout, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that came from days of constant vigilance and the physical drain of living in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in peacetime. Above him, through gaps in the timber roof that let in cold air and occasional snow, stars emerged as clouds cleared, their light cold and distant like hope that seemed beautiful but provided no warmth. He thought about the problem the way his father had taught him to think about hunting, breaking it down into components that could be addressed individually rather than being overwhelmed by the whole. The rifle was accurate enough. Eugene had fired it enough to know its tendencies intimately. The slight pull to the left that developed after the barrel heated from sustained firing, the way the trigger broke cleanly. If you applied pressure at just the right angle with steady increase rather than a jerk, the particular sound it made when functioning properly. versus the slightly different report that indicated something needed attention. The ammunition was consistent, manufactured to standards that would have seemed miraculous to his grandfather, who had hunted with whatever cartridges he could afford and learned to compensate for variations between different manufacturers. What he lacked was the ability to see clearly at distance, to identify targets and gauge wind with the certainty that optical magnification provided, to distinguish between a bush moving in the breeze and a German soldier repositioning. In the corner of his dugout, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the moisture that pervaded everything in the winter trenches and turned metal into rust within days of exposure, was a pair of binoculars Eugene had taken from a captured German position 3 weeks earlier during a patrol that had gone sideways when they stumbled into an abandoned observation post. They were excellent optics, providing clear magnification up to 8 times, far superior to anything in the American supply chain that reached units like the 333rd, which received equipment after everyone else had taken their pick. He had been using them for observation, scanning the German lines during quiet moments, learning the patterns of their movement and trying to identify positions that might prove vulnerable. Eugene pulled the binoculars from their wrapping and studied them in the dim light of a shielded candle that provided just enough illumination to work by, without creating a glow that might attract enemy attention. The lenses were pristine, the mechanism smooth despite the rough handling they had endured, German engineering at its finest applied to a tool of war. An idea began forming, audacious in its simplicity, potentially ridiculous in its execution, the kind of improvisation that emerged when desperation met necessity and conventional solutions proved inadequate. But desperation and necessity had always been the parents of innovation, and Eugene had both in abundance, along with a lifetime of experience making unlikely things work because he had no other choice. By morning, working through the night with determination that overrode exhaustion, he had fashioned a mounting system, using materials scavenged from the detritus of war that accumulated around any long-held position. Wire from destroyed communications equipment provided the base structure, the kind of heavy-gauge wire that held its shape but could still be bent with effort. Pieces of metal strapping, carefully bent and shaped using a rock as a hammer and a trench wall as an anvil, created brackets that could grip both the binoculars and the rifle without damaging either. Rubber from a gas mask seal formed padding that would absorb recoil without shifting the alignment, cushioning the impact that could destroy optics, not designed to withstand the forces generated by a high-powered rifle cartridge. It was crude, assembled in darkness by cold fingers that could barely feel the materials they manipulated. Fingers that had lost sensation hours earlier, but kept working through muscle memory and determination. But when Eugene finally secured the binoculars to the top of his Springfield rifle, wrapping the assembly with additional wire to ensure everything held firm, the assembly held together with a solidity that surprised him. The other soldiers in his unit watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism, as Eugene test-fitted his creation in the pale light of dawn, emerging from his dugout with a rifle that looked like something from a science fiction story rather than a weapon of war. Corporal James Henderson, a mechanic from Detroit who had been assigned to the infantry when the need for bodies exceeded the need for his technical skills. A man who understood machinery and engineering principles, even if he had never worked on anything quite like this, examined the improvised scope with professional interest that overcame his initial incredulity. Henderson said, running his finger along the wire mounting and testing its stability with gentle pressure, "That is the craziest thing I have seen anyone try to make work, and I have seen some desperate improvisation in this war. No offense intended, Walker, but those binoculars were not designed to handle the recoil of a 30-06 round, generating several thousand foot-pounds of energy in a fraction of a second. First shot, that whole assembly is going to rattle apart or punch you in the face hard enough to break bones, and either way you will be no better off than you started." Eugene smiled, the expression tight with tension and determination, and a confidence born from necessity rather than certainty. "Only one way to find out, Corporal, and if it does not work, if this whole idea falls apart with the first shot, I will be no worse off than I am now. Worst case, I go back to iron sights and keep doing what I have been doing. Best case, I can reach out and touch someone who thinks they are safe at distances we cannot normally engage. Morrison approved a test firing during the mid-morning lull when both sides typically avoided unnecessary exposure, when exhausted soldiers on both sides of the line grabbed what rest they could and tried to warm themselves with coffee that tasted terrible but provided precious heat. Eugene set up in a reinforced position, sandbags arranged to provide a stable rest that would absorb some of the recoil and give him the steadiest possible platform, and aimed at a tree stump roughly 300 yards distant that provided a clearly visible target. Through the binoculars-turned scope, adjusting his position until the optics aligned properly with his right eye while his left remained closed, the target appeared close enough to touch, every detail of the weathered wood visible with startling clarity that made him understand just how much advantage proper optics provided. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with familiar force, the recoil impulse he had felt thousands of times transferring energy through the stock and into his body. And for a moment, Eugene feared Henderson had been right, that the crude mounting would fail immediately and send German optics flying into the frozen mud. But when he reopened his eyes, focusing past the instinctive flinch that came from firing any weapon, the binoculars remained in place, shifted slightly from the recoil, but still firmly attached to the rifle, the wire and rubber mounting having absorbed and distributed forces that could have destroyed a less carefully considered assembly. The tree stump showed fresh splintering exactly where he had aimed, wood fragments bright against weathered grey, confirming that the shot had gone exactly where he intended, Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that surprised Eugene coming from a man who had seen years of combat and thought he had witnessed every variation of military improvisation. That is some remarkable shooting, Private. How does it feel? Can you actually use this thing under combat conditions, or was that one good shot that will not repeat? Strange, Eugene admitted, working the bolt to chamber another round, with movements that had become automatic through countless repetitions, the mechanical process requiring no conscious thought. The weight is all wrong, throws off the balance in ways that make the rifle feel like a different weapon entirely, and I can only use my right eye, which means my depth perception is compromised in ways that will take some getting used to. But I can see clear as day at distances, where everything would normally be just a blur of shapes and shadows, where I would be guessing whether I was aiming at a person, or a piece of equipment, or just a bush. That clarity is worth the awkwardness. Over the next 2 hours, Eugene fired 17 more rounds, adjusting the mounting after each shot, experimenting with different holds and positions, learning the peculiarities of his hybrid weapon with the methodical attention to detail that characterized his approach to any tool that his life might depend on. By noon, having burned through ammunition that made the supply sergeant nervous until Morrison explained what they were testing, Eugene could consistently hit man-sized targets at distances exceeding 500 yards, ranges at which most riflemen could barely determine if they were shooting at a person or a bush, much less aim with precision. The real test came on December 9th, when the temperature dropped even further and a light snow began falling, creating conditions that would challenge even the most skilled marksman by obscuring vision and making wind calculation more difficult. Eugene took his position in the forward observation post at dawn, the time when German snipers typically began their work, using the low angle of the rising sun to blind American observers while they acquired targets with backlit clarity. Through his improvised scope, Eugene could see the German lines with unprecedented clarity that transformed his tactical understanding of the position. He watched a figure moving behind what appeared to be a pile of logs roughly 650 yards distant, the movement cautious but following a pattern that suggested routine rather than tactical awareness. Someone who had done this same thing many times and stopped thinking about the risks. The German sniper, Eugene realized with the instinct that came from understanding hunting behavior, had made this same movement every morning for days, confident that no American could reach him at this range with the equipment they were known to possess. Eugene calculated the shot the way his father had taught him, feeling the wind against his cheek and noting its strength and direction, noting how the falling snow angled as it descended, which told him about wind at different altitudes between his position and the target. The target was at the extreme range of his ability, even with the improvised scope. requiring him to aim nearly 3 feet above the actual point of impact to compensate for the bullet drop over such distance, a hold that felt absurd but that mathematics and experience confirmed was necessary. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate through concentration, waiting for the moment of absolute stillness between breaths when the rifle would move least and his body would be most stable. The shot surprised him, as all good shots do when everything comes together perfectly, the trigger breaking cleanly when everything aligned, and his subconscious decided the moment was right. Through the scope, Eugene saw the German figure stumble and disappear behind the logs, the movement suggesting impact, though he could not confirm lethal effect at this distance. He could not confirm what damage, if any, his bullet had done, but the figure did not reappear, and the position remained silent for the rest of the day, suggesting that at minimum he had scored a hit that put someone out of action. Word spread through the American lines, with the speed that rumors always travel in combat zones, where men have little to do except talk and speculate. A black soldier had reached out and touched someone at a range that seemed impossible, using equipment he had built himself from salvaged parts in a freezing dugout with improvised tools. Some soldiers refused to believe it, certain that the story had been exaggerated, in retelling the way all combat stories grew in the telling, convinced that there had to be some other explanation for what had happened. Others saw it as confirmation of what they had always suspected. That skill and determination could overcome equipment disadvantages if applied with sufficient creativity, and that the segregation that defined their service was based on prejudice rather than capability. The German snipers, however, experienced something entirely different, a shift in tactical dynamics that challenged their understanding of the battlefield. They knew their positions had been compromised, that someone on the American side had identified their locations and engaged them effectively, but the nature of the threat confused them in ways that doctrine had not prepared them for. The shot that had come from the American lines had been too accurate for iron sights at that range, but their observers had not seen any evidence of American sniper teams deploying with optical equipment, had not detected the kind of specialized units that would normally be assigned to counter-sniper operations. The mystery created hesitation, uncertainty replacing the confidence that had previously characterized their operations. On December 10th, Eugene repeated his success, this time engaging a target at 720 yards, a distance that stretched his improvised system to its absolute limits and required calculations that bordered on guesswork. The German sniper had been working from a position in a partially destroyed farmhouse, using holes in the wall to create shooting ports that offered protection and concealment while providing good visibility of the American positions. Eugene spent 40 minutes observing the position, learning the pattern of movement, waiting for the moment when his target would present a clear silhouette against the lighter background of the interior wall. When the shot came, Eugene did not wait to observe the result, having learned the fundamental rule of counter-sniper work. He had learned in Georgia that you never stayed in one spot after firing at an intelligent opponent who could shoot back. That movement meant survival, while remaining static meant becoming a target yourself. He moved to a secondary position 30 yards away, reaching it just as German mortar fire began impacting the area where he had been, explosions that would have killed him if he had remained to admire his shooting. The enemy had triangulated his muzzle flash, responding with the kind of coordinated fire that indicated professional military training and good communication. But Eugene was already gone, his improvised scope carefully protected as he relocated through routes he had planned before taking the shot. Henderson found him in the new position 2 hours later, bringing hot coffee that tasted like motor oil but provided warmth that Eugene desperately needed, heat that spread through his core and reminded his body what comfort felt like. The corporal studied the rifle and its bizarre optical addition with renewed respect that went beyond professional interest to something approaching awe. Henderson said, settling into the position beside Eugene and sharing the coffee in the way soldiers did when they recognized excellence, I talked to Morrison. He wants to know if you can teach this trick to others. Create more of these scope things you have invented, so we can field multiple counter-snipers instead of just one. Eugene shook his head slowly, understanding the question, but knowing the answer would disappoint. These binoculars are German-made, From their supplies quality we cannot match with American equipment. We do not have optics of this quality in our equipment stores, certainly not for a unit like ours that gets the last pick of everything. And even if we did, it takes time to learn how to use this setup. The eye relief is wrong, the mounting is not stable enough for rapid engagement, and you have to completely relearn your shooting technique to compensate for the weight distribution. This is not something you can teach in an afternoon or even a week. What he did not say, what Henderson probably already understood from watching him work, was that Eugene had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. All those years hunting to feed his family, all those shots taken with equipment inferior to what his white neighbors possessed, all that experience of succeeding despite systematic disadvantage had created skills that could not be quickly transferred to others, capabilities built through necessity over decades rather than acquired through training courses. The German command recognized they had a problem on December 11th, when a third sniper failed to return from his position and radio contact was lost. Their after-action reports, recovered years later by historians studying the battle, described an American sharpshooter of unusual ability operating in a sector they had considered secure, someone who displayed capabilities inconsistent with intelligence assessments of American units in that area. What troubled them most was the inconsistency. The fact that this phantom marksman did not engage targets every day, did not follow predictable patterns, appeared and disappeared without warning in ways that made counteraction difficult. They began changing their tactics, rotating positions more frequently than operational efficiency would normally dictate, limiting exposure even during times when they would normally work without concern, treating the American lines with the kind of caution they normally reserved for situations where they suspected enemy sniper teams with equivalent equipment. The psychological impact exceeded the actual casualties Eugene inflicted, creating an environment of uncertainty that degraded their effectiveness far beyond what the loss of individual soldiers would suggest. The German snipers, who had operated with near impunity for weeks, now faced uncertainty every time they approached their positions, never knowing if this would be the day the phantom marksman was watching their location. On December 14th, Eugene encountered a challenge that no amount of skill could overcome alone, when warfare shifted from the calculated precision of marksmanship to the chaos of close combat. German forces launched a limited offensive in his sector, pushing forward with infantry supported by armored vehicles, attempting to straighten their line and capture better defensive terrain before the major offensive they were planning. The 333rd found itself in the kind of close combat where marksmanship meant less than volume of fire and willingness to stand firm under pressure that would make weaker units break and run. Eugene fought with his rifle stripped of the improvised scope, which was too fragile and unwieldy for the rapid shooting that the situation demanded, too specialized for circumstances where targets appeared at 50 yards rather than 500. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, his training taking over as conscious thought became impossible in the chaos, muscle memory executing sequences that his mind could not consciously process quickly enough. Around him, his fellow soldiers held the line with a determination that surprised the German attackers, who had been told these segregated units lacked the discipline and courage for sustained combat, that they would break easily under determined pressure. The American soldiers proved those assumptions wrong with actions that spoke louder than any words could have, standing their ground when retreat would have been understandable and fighting with effectiveness that earned respect even from enemies. The offensive stalled after 6 hours of intense fighting, German forces withdrawing to their original positions with casualties they could not afford and objectives they had failed to achieve, their attack having accomplished nothing except proving that American determination could overcome their tactical advantages. In the aftermath, as medics worked among the wounded and soldiers collected ammunition from those who no longer needed it, redistributing resources in the pragmatic way that combat soldiers learned quickly, Morrison found Eugene sitting against a trench wall, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. Morrison said, sitting down beside him in the mud that never quite dried regardless of how cold it got, "You did good work today, Walker. All of you did. Command is going to hear about this, about how a unit they barely wanted in the fight held a position that regulars might have abandoned. Maybe it will not change anything. Probably it will not, given how this army works, but at least they will know. Eugene nodded, too tired for words, his mind still processing what had happened and beginning to feel the delayed reactions that came after combat when your body realized it was still alive. The improvised scope, carefully stored in its oilcloth wrapping during the fighting, had survived the day undamaged, waiting for the moment when it would again be needed. That moment came sooner than expected, before Eugene had fully recovered from the exhaustion of close combat. On December 16th, before dawn broke over the frozen landscape, the German military launched what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest that caught Allied command completely by surprise, despite intelligence warnings they had dismissed as implausible. The 333rd Infantry Regiment found itself directly in the path of the assault, part of a thin line of American forces facing a German army that had concentrated armor and infantry for one desperate attempt to split the Allied front and reach the coast, gambling everything on a strategic victory that might force negotiation. The fighting that followed tested every soldier beyond anything they had previously experienced, pushing them past limits they did not know they possessed. Units became separated, communication broke down as headquarters were overrun or forced to relocate, and individual initiative became the difference between survival and destruction as the carefully planned command structure dissolved under pressure. In the chaos, Eugene and a small group from his company, 12 men total including Morrison, found themselves cut off from the main American lines, holding a crossroads that German forces needed to maintain their advance schedule, a tactically insignificant position that became strategically vital through accident of geography. For 3 days they held that position against attacks that came with mechanical regularity, German forces probing their defenses and launching assaults that increased in intensity as the importance of the crossroads became apparent. Eugene used his improvised scope when conditions allowed, engaging German officers and machine gun crews at ranges that the enemy could not effectively return fire, using precision shooting to disrupt attacks before they developed momentum. When the fighting came close, when German infantry pushed to within grenade range, he abandoned the scope and fought with iron sights, his rifle becoming just another weapon in a desperate defense that had no business succeeding against the odds they faced. Henderson, fighting beside him on the second day, watched Eugene drop a German machine gunner at a distance that seemed impossible, given the stress and chaos of the situation, a shot that stopped an attack that might have overrun their position. The corporal said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes about the respect he had developed for the quiet marksman from Georgia, respect that transcended race and rank, and all the artificial divisions that defined their service. On the third day, American forces broke through to relieve them, tanks and infantry from divisions that had been rushed south to contain the German offensive, units that had fought through desperate circumstances to reach isolated positions that held against impossible odds. Of the 12 men who had held the crossroads, 9 survived, a casualty rate that was considered miraculous given the odds they had faced and the intensity of attacks they had repelled. Morrison, wounded but alive, his arm bandaged and secured against his chest, submitted a report that detailed Eugene's contribution to their survival, describing the improvised scope and the way one man's ingenuity had multiplied the defensive effectiveness of an isolated unit facing forces that should have overwhelmed them easily. The report reached officers who understood its significance beyond the immediate tactical situation, implications that extended into questions about military policy and the capabilities of segregated units. Here was evidence that segregated units, given proper leadership and opportunity, could perform at levels equal to or exceeding their white counterparts, that the assumptions underlying military segregation were based on prejudice rather than objective assessment of capability. More importantly, it demonstrated that resourcefulness and individual skill could sometimes overcome equipment disadvantages that seemed insurmountable, that American soldiers could innovate and adapt in ways that formal doctrine did not anticipate. Eugene received a Bronze Star for his actions during those 3 days, a medal presented in a quiet ceremony that received none of the publicity given to similar awards in other units, recognition that came without the attention that might have made it meaningful beyond the immediate participants. The citation mentioned his marksmanship, but said nothing about the improvised scope, nothing about the ingenuity that had turned salvaged binoculars into a weapon that changed the dynamics of small unit combat in his sector, bureaucratic language that captured facts while missing significance. The war continued. The Battle of the Bulge eventually contained and reversed as American industrial might ground down German resistance through sheer weight of resources that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Eugene continued fighting, his improvised scope remaining in service until the day a German shell fragment damaged the binoculars beyond repair, sending shards of glass through the mounting that had held them secure for so many weeks, destroying in seconds what had taken hours to create. He went back to iron sights, his skill undiminished, but his effective range reduced to distances that felt claustrophobic after the clarity his creation had provided, like losing a sense he had briefly possessed. Years later, military historians studying the Battle of the Bulge would find references to an American marksman operating in the Bastogne sector who had achieved results that seemed inconsistent with the equipment available to infantry units at that time, anomalies in casualty reports and after-action summaries that suggested capabilities that should not have existed. Some dismissed these reports as exaggerations, the kind of tall tales that emerge from any combat situation, where stress and fear distort perception and facts get embellished in retelling. Others recognized them as evidence of something more significant, a demonstration that necessity and creativity could briefly level playing fields that institutional advantages had tilted. For Eugene, the experience shaped everything that followed, becoming a defining moment that influenced how he approached every subsequent challenge. He returned to Georgia after the war, using the educational benefits promised to veterans to attend college, becoming a teacher in the same county where his father had sharecropped, educating children whose parents had picked cotton in fields his family had worked. He never spoke much about the war, deflecting questions with the quiet modesty common among men who had seen combat and understood its true cost, who knew that real heroism rarely resembled what movies portrayed. The improvised scope existed only in his memories and in Morrison's after-action report, filed away in archives that few would ever examine. A footnote in records that barely acknowledged the contributions of segregated units. But he taught his students, both black and white once the schools integrated in the 1960s, that limitation was often an illusion created by lack of imagination, that problems that seemed insurmountable could be broken down into components that admitted solution. He showed them how problems could be broken into components, how solutions existed for those willing to look beyond conventional approaches, how the tools at hand could be repurposed for applications their designers never envisioned. Some understood that he was talking about more than academics, that his lessons emerged from experiences he chose not to detail, but that had shaped his understanding of what was possible. Morrison stayed in contact with Eugene after the war, the two men maintaining a correspondence that lasted until Morrison's death in 1978, letters that documented decades of friendship built on shared experience. In their letters, they discussed family, politics, the slow progress toward equality that neither man lived to see fully realized, the persistent challenges of a society that changed slowly when it changed at all. Occasionally, Morrison would mention the crossroads, those 3 days when skill and determination had proven sufficient against odds that should have been overwhelming, when 12 men had held against forces that should have crushed them. Eugene would respond with characteristic understatement, noting that they had been lucky, that circumstances had aligned in their favor, that any other outcome would have been the expected result. What neither man acknowledged in their letters, but what both understood perfectly, was that those days had represented something larger than tactical success, that their meaning extended beyond military history into questions about capability and prejudice. In a military that segregated its forces and doubted the capabilities of black soldiers, Eugene had demonstrated excellence that could not be dismissed or diminished, performance that challenged fundamental assumptions about race and ability. His improvised scope, crude and impractical by conventional standards, had become a symbol of what could be achieved when institutional barriers were overcome through individual initiative, when necessity forced innovation that doctrine would never have anticipated. Henderson, who became an engineer after the war, Working on automotive designs in the same Detroit plants that had produced the tanks and trucks that won the conflict, occasionally told the story of Eugene's invention to colleagues who expressed skepticism about unconventional approaches to technical problems. He described watching a man turn binoculars and wire into a precision instrument, watching him achieve results that equipment alone could not guarantee, watching him prove that innovation emerged from need rather than resources, that desperation could father solutions that comfort would never discover. The German snipers who survived the war, interviewed decades later by historians researching the Battle of the Bulge and trying to understand how individual actions influenced larger outcomes, remembered the period around Bastogne as unusually challenging, a time when their dominance evaporated and they found themselves fighting at a disadvantage. They spoke of losing the psychological advantage they had enjoyed, of facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded what they expected from American infantry units, particularly from segregated units they had been told were inferior. Some recalled rumors of a black soldier with supernatural marksmanship ability, stories dismissed at the time as excuses for failure, but remembered as possibly containing truth, once the passage of years made honesty less costly and pride less important than accuracy. Modern military analysts, studying Eugene's achievement with the perspective of 70 years and access to records from both sides, recognize several factors that contributed to his success beyond mere skill. The Springfield rifle, though antiquated compared to later weapons and being phased out even as he used it, was inherently accurate at long ranges, a quality built into its design that remained relevant despite newer weapons offering other advantages. The German binoculars provided optical quality equal to dedicated sniper scopes of the period, precision that came from manufacturing traditions and quality control that few could match. Eugene's hunting background gave him skills that military training alone could not develop, instincts honed through necessity rather than acquired through instruction. The psychological impact of facing an unexpected threat multiplied the actual tactical effect of his shooting, creating disruption beyond what casualties alone would suggest. But analysis misses what made the story significant to those who lived it, the human dimensions that statistics cannot capture. In an army that relegated black soldiers to support roles based on assumptions about their capabilities, Eugene proved that competence and creativity had no relationship to skin color. That excellence emerged from character and determination rather than complexion. In a military culture that valued equipment over ingenuity, he demonstrated that individual skill could overcome material disadvantages, that the person using the tool mattered more than the tool itself. In a war increasingly defined by industrial production and massive resource deployment, he showed that one person with determination and improvised tools could still matter, that individual action retained significance even in conflicts decided by nations rather than soldiers. The 333rd Infantry Regiment received recognition after the war for its performance during the Battle of the Bulge, commendations that acknowledged the courage and effectiveness of a unit many had doubted would perform under pressure. Eugene's contribution, while noted in official records and mentioned in Morrison's reports, never received the publicity given to similar achievements by soldiers in non-segregated units, buried in files that few accessed and fewer still understood. The improvised scope disappeared into history, its existence documented in a handful of after-action reports that languished in archives until researchers began examining the role of black soldiers in the European theater, trying to understand contributions that had been systematically minimized. Eugene Walker passed away in 1993 at the age of 72, having lived a quiet life dedicated to education and family, service that touched hundreds of students over decades of teaching. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but provided no details beyond his unit and the theater where he fought, standard language that appeared in thousands of such notices. The Bronze Star he received sat in a drawer, shown occasionally to grandchildren who asked about the war but mostly forgotten, as his focus shifted to the battles of civil rights and educational equality that consumed the decades after his return. Struggles that seemed more relevant to the world he inhabited than events from a war that felt increasingly distant. In 2004, A researcher examining records from the Battle of the Bulge discovered Morrison's after-action report and recognized its significance, understanding what the bureaucratic language described. The detailed description of Eugene's improvised scope, the tactical results it achieved, and the circumstances under which it was used provided a window into the ingenuity that emerged from necessity during the war, innovation that happened far from laboratories and research facilities. The researcher published an article in a military history journal bringing Eugene's story to an audience that could appreciate its technical and historical significance, giving recognition that came too late for the subject, but that helped document a broader truth about capability and innovation. Attempts to recreate the improvised scope using period-appropriate materials and similar binoculars confirmed that the system could work but required exceptional skill to use effectively, capabilities that went far beyond what average soldiers possessed. The mounting was inherently unstable, the eye relief problematic in ways that created challenges even for experienced shooters, the weight distribution awkward in ways that affected accuracy. That Eugene had achieved consistent accuracy under combat conditions spoke to abilities that went far beyond what could be attributed to the equipment alone, skill that represented a lifetime of development rather than simple talent. The story resonated with modern soldiers who understood the reality of making do with available resources, of adapting equipment for purposes beyond its original design, of succeeding despite institutional barriers and systemic disadvantages that created challenges beyond enemy action. Eugene's improvised scope became a teaching example in some military courses on innovation and adaptation, a reminder that effectiveness came from the person using the tool rather than the tool itself, that resourcefulness remained relevant even in an age of technological sophistication. For the German snipers who faced Eugene, who experienced the unsettling shift from hunters to hunted in a battlefield they thought they controlled, the lesson came in a form that military doctrine could not easily incorporate into training. They had been trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment, in the advantage that precision optics and professional development provided, in assumptions about American capabilities that intelligence had reinforced. The existence of an opponent who could match their effectiveness with improvised equipment and natural skill challenged assumptions they had built their entire tactical approach upon, forcing reconsideration of beliefs that had seemed unquestionable. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation, affecting operations throughout the sector. When soldiers who had operated with confidence suddenly faced uncertainty, when their perceived advantages proved insufficient against an opponent who refused to accept limitations, the erosion of morale affected performance in ways that casualties alone could not explain. Eugene had not just eliminated individual snipers, he had undermined the entire framework of assumptions that made their operations effective, introducing doubt that spread beyond those directly engaged. This understanding, that psychological warfare could be waged through unexpected capability rather than propaganda or deception, became part of military thinking in the decades that followed. The lesson was not that every soldier should improvise their own equipment, which would be impractical and potentially dangerous, but that assumptions about enemy capabilities were dangerous, that underestimating opponents based on preconceptions could prove fatal, that the unexpected often decided outcomes in ways that planning and resources could not prevent. Modern doctrine incorporates this lesson, though few know its origin in a frozen forest where a black soldier with binoculars and wire challenged assumptions about what was possible. Eugene's students, those who paid attention to lessons that went beyond curriculum requirements and understood that teaching could convey more than facts, carried forward understanding that shaped their own approaches to challenges. They learned that barriers were often artificial, that solutions existed for those willing to look beyond conventional wisdom, that authority and resources did not guarantee correctness. Some became engineers, teachers, business leaders, carrying forward the principle that creativity and determination could overcome systematic disadvantages, applying lessons learned in a Georgia classroom to challenges their teacher could never have anticipated. The improvised scope, that crude assembly of wire and scavenged optics that existed for only a few weeks before destruction, represented something fundamental about human ingenuity under pressure, about what emerges when necessity meets capability. When Eugene created it, he was not trying to prove a philosophical point or challenge military doctrine or make any kind of statement beyond the immediate. He was solving a practical problem with available materials, drawing on skills developed through necessity, applying creativity born from a lifetime of making do with less than others possessed. That the solution worked, that it changed tactical dynamics in his sector, that it challenged assumptions about capability and equipment were consequences rather than intentions. The fact that the solution came from a black soldier in a segregated unit, using equipment salvaged from the enemy and materials scavenged from debris, using skills developed through poverty and discrimination, gave the achievement meaning beyond its tactical impact. It demonstrated what military leadership had refused to acknowledge, that ability existed independent of race, that innovation emerged from necessity regardless of who experienced that necessity, that the assumptions underlying segregation were false. This lesson, though slow to be learned and implemented, eventually contributed to military integration and recognition that capability should determine opportunity. The winter of 1944 moved toward 1945, temperatures dropping to levels that made combat almost secondary to the struggle against nature itself. Eugene continued his work, now without his improvised scope, but with a reputation that preceded him. Other soldiers in the 333rd treated him differently, not with the casual dismissal that segregation encouraged, but with respect earned through demonstrated capability. Henderson made several attempts to repair the damaged binoculars, spending hours in cold dugouts trying to replace shattered lenses with materials that proved inadequate. But German precision optics could not be replicated with salvaged glass and improvised techniques. The scope was gone, its brief existence over, but what it had proven remained. Morrison, his arm healing slowly from the wound received at the crossroads, wrote additional reports about the engagement, detailed accounts that went beyond standard after-action summaries to analyze what had happened and why. He described Eugene's contribution in technical terms that command could understand, noting effective engagement ranges, estimated casualties inflicted, psychological impact on enemy operations. He also wrote about the broader implications, though he knew these portions would likely be ignored or dismissed. A segregated unit had held against overwhelming odds. A black soldier had demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every assumption underlying military segregation. Individual ingenuity had overcome institutional disadvantages. These facts existed regardless of whether command chose to acknowledge them. Other officers in segregated units, hearing about the 333rd through informal channels that existed parallel to official communication, began requesting similar resources and opportunities for their soldiers. If a black soldier with salvaged equipment could achieve results that matched or exceeded white units with proper gear, what could properly supported black units accomplish? The question went largely unanswered, as military bureaucracy moved slowly when it moved at all, but seeds of change had been planted in frozen Belgian soil, ideas that would grow in subsequent years as the military confronted questions about capability and integration. German intelligence officers, analyzing casualty patterns and after-action reports from the Bastogne sector, noted anomalies they could not fully explain. Sniper casualties had increased in a specific area during a specific period, then returned to previous levels, suggesting a temporary deployment of specialized American units. But no evidence existed of such deployments, no radio intercepts or prisoner interrogations confirming sniper teams operating in that sector. The mystery remained unsolved, filed away in reports that would be captured when Germany surrendered and studied by American analysts trying to understand enemy perceptions of their operations. What those analysts discovered surprised them. The Germans had attributed Eugene's success to specialized units that did not exist, assuming organizational capability rather than individual initiative because their own doctrine emphasized units over individuals. They had never considered that a single soldier with improvised equipment could achieve the results they documented. This assumption, that capability required formal organization and proper equipment, had blinded them to a more significant threat, the creativity and determination of individual American soldiers who refused to accept limitations as permanent. January brought continued fighting. as Allied forces pushed back gains from the German offensive, grinding forward through winter conditions that made every mile costly in ways beyond casualties. Eugene fought through these weeks with iron sights, his marksmanship still exceptional, but his effective range reduced to distances that felt limiting after experiencing the clarity his scope had provided. He adapted as soldiers must, finding ways to contribute that did not require optical magnification. His hunting skills, developed through necessity in Georgia woods, proved valuable in ways beyond marksmanship. He could read terrain, predict movement patterns, identify optimal positions for observation or fire. Morrison relied on his judgment increasingly, asking his opinion on tactical matters and implementing suggestions that proved sound. Henderson, watching this dynamic develop, recognized something significant. Morrison had learned what segregation tried to deny, that competence existed independent of race, that good ideas came from anyone willing to think, rather than from rank or background alone. Other soldiers in the unit observed and learned similar lessons. Black soldiers who had been taught their entire lives that they were inferior watched one of their own earn respect through demonstrated ability. White soldiers who had absorbed cultural prejudices confronted evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. These lessons, learned in frozen trenches under conditions that stripped away pretense, would influence how men thought about race and capability long after the war ended. February brought the end of organized German resistance as Allied forces advanced against collapsing defenses. The 333rd participated in these final operations, clearing positions that weeks earlier would have been heavily defended. Eugene witnessed the collapse of an army, watching soldiers who had fought with determination become refugees fleeing defeat. He felt no particular triumph, understanding that individual soldiers on both sides had done what circumstances required. The discovery of concentration camps as forces advanced provided context that transformed understanding of the war. Eugene had known intellectually that he fought against evil, but seeing the evidence directly made abstract concepts horrifyingly concrete. He understood then that his service had meaning beyond personal survival, that this war represented a genuine battle between fundamentally different visions of human society. This understanding influenced how he thought about discrimination at home, providing perspective that shaped his subsequent activism. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with German surrender. The 333rd remained in Europe through summer, performing occupation duties. Eugene used this time to observe, watching how victory was organized, how defeated populations were managed, gaining real-world understanding of how history actually unfolded. Morrison received transfer orders in August, ending their daily interaction, but beginning a correspondence that would last decades. Their final conversation, conducted in a dusty office in what had been a German administrative building, covered topics beyond military service. Morrison spoke about returning to civilian life, about whether to remain in the army or pursue other opportunities, about how to process experiences that had fundamentally changed how he understood the world. Eugene shared his plans to pursue education, to become a teacher, to work for change through methods less dramatic than combat, but potentially more lasting. Morrison said, as they prepared to part, "You changed how I think about a lot of things, Walker. I grew up in a culture that taught me black soldiers could not be trusted in combat, that segregation reflected natural differences rather than artificial barriers. Watching you work, fighting beside you, made me confront how wrong those teachings were. I do not know if that makes any difference in the larger scheme of things, but I wanted you to know." Eugene nodded, understanding the significance of the admission and the courage it took to acknowledge being wrong about fundamental beliefs. "It makes a difference to me, Sergeant, and maybe if enough people learn the same lesson, it will make a difference in that larger scheme you mentioned. Either way, I appreciate you saying it." The journey home gave Eugene time to process what he had experienced and what it meant for his future. The troop ship carrying segregated units back across the Atlantic moved slowly. Eugene spent hours on deck, watching ocean waves and thinking about what came next. He had survived combat, witnessed the collapse of an evil regime, proven capabilities that segregation denied, Now he needed to determine how to use those experiences to contribute to a society that had not yet learned the lessons the war should have taught. Returning to Georgia meant confronting unchanged systems despite changed individuals. The Jim Crow South that Eugene had left still existed, the same laws and customs operating as if nothing had happened. Veterans who had risked their lives for democracy abroad could not vote at home, could not eat in certain restaurants, could not attend schools with white students. This disconnect created frustrations that fueled the civil rights movement, as veterans refused to accept what they had been willing to die opposing. Eugene channeled his frustration into education, using military benefits to attend college despite obstacles. He studied history and education, learning while developing understanding of how societies changed or failed to change. By 1948, he held a degree and teaching certificate, qualifications that allowed him to work in black schools. His classroom became a laboratory for ideas about education and equality. Eugene taught standard curriculum, but also lessons textbooks did not contain. He taught that limitations were often artificial, that problems could be broken down and solved through systematic thinking, that resourcefulness mattered more than resources. Students who paid attention absorbed attitudes that would serve them throughout their lives. Some students asked about the war, noticing his service certificate, but understanding that many veterans preferred not to discuss experiences. Eugene told selected stories, careful to avoid graphic details but willing to share lessons about courage and perseverance. He spoke about Morrison, a white officer who treated black soldiers with respect. He spoke about Henderson, a mechanic who recognized excellence wherever it appeared. He never mentioned the improvised scope or combat specifics, but students absorbed principles from those experiences. Years passed, bringing slow change to American society and dramatic change to individual lives. The Supreme Court decision in 1954 declaring school segregation unconstitutional provided legal foundation for changes that took years to implement and faced fierce resistance. Eugene witnessed this process directly, watching as his county slowly, reluctantly integrated schools, combining black and white student populations that had been artificially separated for generations. He continued teaching through this transition, working with students and parents on both sides of racial divides, trying to build understanding while addressing fears and misconceptions that segregation had fostered. Some white parents objected to having a black teacher, even one with Eugene's qualifications and reputation, demanding reassignment for their children. School administrators, trying to navigate impossible political situations, initially accommodated these demands, creating segregated classrooms within integrated buildings. Eugene accepted this compromise while working to demonstrate through excellence what some parents refused to acknowledge through principle. Students who spent time in his classroom, regardless of race, learned quickly that he challenged them to think, expected excellence, and treated everyone with respect that transcended racial categories. Word spread among students, if not always among parents, creating demand for his classes that eventually overcame prejudice through practical recognition of quality. Morrison visited once, driving down from Pennsylvania in the early 1960s to reconnect with his friend and see what Eugene had built in the years since the war. They spent a weekend together, talking about their lives and how the world had changed or failed to change. Morrison had left the military, working now in manufacturing, his war experiences having taught him skills in leadership and organization that proved valuable in civilian contexts. He spoke about watching civil rights protests on television, about feeling guilt for not being more actively involved, about struggling to explain to his children why the country had not lived up to ideals he thought they had fought for. Eugene listened and shared his own frustrations, the slow pace of change, the resistance that seemed impervious to reason or justice, the exhaustion that came from fighting battles that should have been won years earlier. But he also spoke about successes, students who had gone on to college or successful careers, small victories in changing attitudes, evidence that education could shift perspectives, even when laws and customs moved slowly. They discussed the crossroads they had held so many years before, agreeing that the lessons from that experience remained relevant, that determination and ingenuity still mattered, that individuals could make differences, even when circumstances seemed overwhelming. Henderson sent occasional letters, less frequently than Morrison, but with updates about his life and career. He had risen through engineering ranks, working on projects that interested him and earning recognition for innovative approaches to technical problems. He credited Eugene's improvised scope, that crude assembly he had watched function against all reasonable expectations, with influencing how he thought about engineering challenges. If binoculars and wire could become a precision instrument in desperate hands, what else might be possible by looking beyond conventional approaches? This question had shaped his career, leading him to solutions that others missed by accepting limitations too readily. Years passed, bringing slow change to American society. The Supreme Court decision in 1954 declaring school segregation unconstitutional provided legal foundation for integration, though implementation took years and faced fierce resistance. Eugene continued teaching through this transition, working with students on both sides of racial divides trying to build understanding. Some white parents objected to having a black teacher, but Eugene's excellence eventually overcame prejudice through practical recognition of quality. Morrison visited once in the early 1960s, reconnecting with his friend. They discussed their lives since the war, frustrations about slow social progress, and successes in changing attitudes. They remembered the crossroads they had held years before, agreeing that lessons from that experience remained relevant, that determination and ingenuity still mattered. Henderson sent occasional letters, crediting Eugene's improvised scope with influencing how he approached engineering challenges throughout his career. Morrison's death in 1978 brought Eugene north for a funeral. Morrison's family welcomed him warmly, asking him to speak about their father. Eugene described a man who had learned to question his assumptions, who had treated black soldiers with respect when that was uncommon, who had remained a friend across racial divides. The story of the improvised scope emerged during conversations after the funeral, fascinating Morrison's family with this glimpse into their father's war experiences. Eugene returned to Georgia, understanding that Morrison's friendship had represented what America could become when individuals chose to transcend cultural prejudices. This understanding influenced how he thought about his own legacy. He intensified his teaching, determined to make the most of opportunities to shape young minds. Retirement came in 1988, bringing celebrations organized by colleagues and former students. Eugene spoke about perseverance, creativity, and treating others with dignity, then left the building carrying forward influence that would persist in students and colleagues. The researcher who discovered Morrison's after-action report in 2004 contacted Eugene, then 83 years old but still mentally sharp, requesting an interview about the improvised scope and its impact. Eugene agreed, though he insisted the scope itself was not particularly significant, just a practical solution to an immediate problem. The researcher understood differently, recognizing how the story illustrated broader themes about ingenuity and the artificial barriers that segregation imposed. The article that resulted brought Eugene's story to audiences who appreciated both its technical and social significance. Military analysts studied it for practical lessons about improvised weapons. Historians recognized it as evidence of capabilities that official records often overlooked. The story spread through various communities, challenging assumptions about capability and creativity. Eugene Walker passed away in 2008, having lived long enough to witness dramatic social changes, including the election of the first black president. His funeral brought together students, colleagues, and fellow veterans who honored a man who had demonstrated through action what words alone could not establish. The improvised scope was mentioned as characteristic of his approach to life, finding creative solutions when conventional approaches proved inadequate. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.